All right, we'll say good day to you this day of your time. How are you all? All right, thank you. And once again, thank you for the co-creation of this interaction and the gift that you are giving to us in allowing us to experience each and every one of you as a different facet of the multidimensional crystal of creation, or as Willa might put it, as all the different shards of the shattered mirror. Now, before we facilitate Willa to speak to you about the winter spirit and the elementals, we would like to add a little, well, we'll call it a little bonus monologue. In that she explained to you in the transmission last night of your time the idea of the 5 levels of mastery, being the cryptic, the nocturnal, the shapeshifter, the sage, and the wraith, being represented symbolically by the triangle of the mountain of earth, the connection to earth, by the wavy line, the nocturnals in the night, the secrets, the wavy line of the water, the emotional depths therein, the arch of the sky representing the shapeshifters to represent the changing weather patterns, the idea of the circle representing the sage, which represents space and the void, and the idea of the dot, which represents the wraith, which is spirit and source. There is also a crossover direct analogy between the 5 levels of mastery and the 5 laws. Number 1, you exist. The level of the cryptic, it is a statement of your existence on earth, a connection and an expression of your life as it is, in the way that you are familiar. Law number 2, everything is here and now. Thus, in the level of the nocturnal, connecting into parallel realities, it is the beginning of the awareness that everything exists all at once and that you can connect to those parallel realities. Law number 3, the one is the all are the one, representing the ability of the shapeshifter to call upon those parallel versions of themselves and represent them to others, actually appearing to turn into those other representations and demonstrating that the one is the all and the all are the one, and it is all interchangeable reflections of each other. The 4th law, what you put out is what you get back, being represented by the sage, who can actually call upon those parallel realities and actually transform entire environments into other worlds, other realities, manifest things out of the void, out of apparently thin air, putting out that vibration that allows them to relate to other realities so strongly that they can transmit that vibration to others so that they can perceive the changes in that reality too. And the 5th law, everything changes except the laws, being represented by the wraith, who thus bridges physical and non-physical reality, matter and spirit, and can call upon the idea of changing the template, the very foundational underlying blueprint of physical reality, to manifest all sorts of transformations, not only in the physical world, but in spirit as well, simultaneously turning physical reality into a living spiritual dream. So the 5 laws correspond very directly to the idea of the expressions of the 5 levels of mastery. Just so you have a more complete picture of the system that is in existence and the knowledge that is expressed 700 years in your future by Willa and many of the hybrids that exist at that time blended into your society on its way to becoming fully the 6th hybrid race. Do you understand? All right. I guess not all of you do. The idea, therefore, is we will now facilitate Willa so that she can discuss with you, share with you the idea of the winter spirit and the elementals as it relates to the concept of your historical understanding and transformation of the winter spirit into the representation, the symbol that you now call Santa Claus. One moment. All right then, good day to you, dearies. How are y'all? Oh, all right. Let us begin this way then, to understand that long ago, even as you count time, humans on your planet had more sensitivity than they express in your contemporary time frame to the idea of nature, when they lived in nature in a more natural way, as you would say, and that they were able to, at least to some degree, sense the presence of the elementals. Now, let us explain before we go on. Elementals can express and have what you would perceive and experience as a physicality of a sort, but many of them are also shapeshifters, and it is from the elementals that the idea of the masteries were developed and that the abilities of the shapeshifters were acquired and learned from them in the beginning. But the idea is that the elementals can manifest themselves in many ways physiologically and sometimes in different forms. But the idea is that they are not exactly physical as you understand physicality. They are part of the nature of your world, of our world, of the earth, what you may call Gaia. They are part of that consciousness expressing itself in a variety of archetypal ways. For consciousness can express itself and divide itself and project itself in a variety of groupings or individualities according to whatever is required by the mass consensus experience. And elementals, for lack of a better term, are like portions of the collective consciousness and the electromagnetheric energy that is associated with the earth, condensing into a form and expression of consciousness that can then sort of wrap itself in the concept of physical reality, but isn't really born in the way you are born as a physical being, nor do they really die in the way that you die as a physical being. They're more like a constant fluctuation of the consciousness that is associated collectively with your world, from the world, of the world, by the world. And they can, perhaps, again, more aptly, like bubbles in a boiling pot, pop up here and there, using the medium of the water, the electromagnetheric energy, to temporarily form the idea of a consolidated focal point that you would recognize in the water as a bubble, but recognize in nature as an elemental. This is why many of them can exist for many hundreds of years, even thousands of years of your time of counting. But the idea is that when they come into being and when they transition into other states, it is more like what the Bashar civilization now experiences, where they are a consolidation very rapidly, where poof, as you say, they are there, and poof, as you say, they are gone, even though they may linger for a long time. But that consciousness can reform itself like clay, like being molded into other forms, and express itself. And so elementals can, in that sense, experience a shift of identities in much the same way that you might allow more of your true being to come through you from time to time, saying that you are truly a different person now, but still recognize a connection, a continuity that you may create. Well, elementals have a little bit less of that continuity. They can flow and change in form and become this and that and appear and disappear in a variety of ways, but they experience that continuity in a very different way than you do. Now that you sort of have a little bit of a picture of the fact that they are certainly far more ephemeral than you're used to seeing in a being that you relate to. In those past times of your counting, humans were more sensitive and more capable of recognizing that elementals existed and sometimes could actually interact with them in a variety of ways. And over time, as your civilization changed and focused on different things, you became less and less aware of the elementals as an actual presence that you could interact with, and many of them became what you would call mythologized and told in your stories in a variety of ways. And sometimes there were different interpretations about what they could do or what they were or what they were all about, some of which remained relatively accurate according to their temperaments, and some of which really spun into stories that almost have nothing at all to do with what they do and who they are and how they live. Nevertheless, you retain the idea of the elementals in your stories enough, sufficiently enough, that you never really lost sight of the fact that you are on some level aware that there are other levels of reality even within your own, other divisions of consciousness, even within what you call the world, and that there are many things that are invisible to you that are around you all the time. But now in this day and age, as you call your contemporary time of transformation, there is the ability to regain those senses again, to expand your senses to the point where you can begin, and have begun in many cases, to know that those elementals do exist among you, have their own reality, their own world, in a sense, blended in, intermingled, intertwined with your own. And bit by bit, as you expand your consciousness and move down through your timeline further and further, you will begin to experience that these beings still do exist, and they will make themselves known to you in a variety of ways as you become more aware and more capable of perceiving and interacting with them. One in particular that we will address this day of your time is what is typically referred to as the winter spirit. Now, it does have a name of old, an ancient name. And in the area in which I live, even though this winter spirit can appear in many different ways around the world in different cultures, in my area of what you would call the Ireland in your time, you will find that it is known by an ancient name of Kerinos. Kerinos. This being is generally described as having elements of a human form, but also elements of animal form, a kind of face that might be reminiscent of what you would call a blend of human and elk, and it does have the expression of large elk-like antlers, and it does have the expression of the cloven hooves, and it does have certain other elements to it that would be considered sort of fawn-like, or of a nature in the sense of what the being you know as Pan or Puck in that sense. But it is a rather large elemental because its energy is very great and it represents the season itself. And its focal point is the winter solstice that you are about to experience in your timeline. But the idea of Kerinos is that it is, to use an ancient term, a kind of a karmic elemental. It is a fourth law elemental, specifically geared to that vibration of what you put out is what you get back. It is that kind of a reflective elemental. And in ancient times, even ancient to you, it expressed this in the way that those that were positive to it, kind to it, loving to it, would receive that in return. But those that were of foul heart within themselves and mean disposition would find that reflected back to them by this fourth law elemental in a variety of ways that represented the concept that became known to you as karma. Because it is simply, again, the fourth law of what you put out is what you get back, and this being can amplify, magnify, and reflect that to you once you engage within that level of consciousness with it. Over time, as you began to lose the sense of the being itself, the winter spirit in its original form, its original expression, as Kerinos, and you drifted away from your knowledge that these beings existed among you, and it began to fade back into its own reality to the point where you could no longer really perceive it in the same way that your ancestors did. But remembering that such encounters did occur, you began to weave different kinds of expressions or different kinds of stories about this being. One of the first that you created was the idea of splitting the being in two to recognize its positive side and recognize its negative side. Now, again, we remind you that when we talk about the idea of positive and negative, like the Bashar, this is not a value judgment, but it is simply a description of the mechanics of positive energy being that which integrates and expands, Negative energy being that which segregates and disconnects in experience. But the idea is that this then became separated into two different beings. Still the original idea of the winter spirit, but then the negative side was embodied in a concept and another being altogether that was given the antlers in the form of horns, still had the cloven hooves, still had some animal aspects to its features, but this being was given a new name, and that name was Krampus. Krampus then became the embodiment of the idea of the negative side, while the positive side was then begun to be associated with other things that came into your society, religious ideas, other forms of spiritual expression. And in the idea of your European area, you will find that it began to be associated with the concept of saints, and in particular the idea of the being you know as Saint Niklaus. But having been divided in this way, it was also then Krampus being associated with the negative polarity of those that believed in the idea of heaven and hell. And thus Krampus also became the embodiment of the devil in that way. For it had the cloven hooves and it had the horns. The idea also is that it was a being of mischief in that sense, in the negative way, reflecting the negativity. But this also continued to evolve in the idea becoming a little bit more benign in what became Santa Claus, where Krampus began to be forgotten. And again, the idea of forming the list and checking it twice to find out who's naughty and find out who's nice. So that became simply an idea that evolved into, or shall we say devolved into, a simple list, a checklist of who was either a good boy or a good girl or a bad boy or a bad girl, allowing the idea to come into some other religious form and go in a different direction and focus on the idea of the giving of gifts and the giving of presents, which originally was the concept of simply making loving offerings to the original Kerinos, winter spirit, and receiving in return the idea of also gifts and offerings to carry beings through the winter, to help support them through the ice and the snow, because the winter spirit, in a sense, could also be represented of that which could control those things, those realities, and allow there to be an easing of those elements that you might experience in the winter time in harsh climes. But understand that there is still that remnant of making those offerings, because even to this day, many of you will leave milk and cookies for Santa Claus. Now, of course, in your society, it has continued to evolve into something, of course, that you would consider to be quite commercial. For you understand that the Santa Claus you know today is purely an invention in terms of the look, in terms of what it does and how it does it. But it still contains that seed and it contains that remnant. It contains, even as a mythology, the connection all the way back to the winter spirit, who, when offered the idea of gifts, would give gifts in return, and who, when presented with foul temperament, would offer foul storms in return. So you can see through the progression of forgetting your connection to nature and no longer being able to interact directly with the winter spirit in the ways of old, that you have allowed this to become something which is a surface feature only, a mythology, a presentation that serves you in the way that your society is now structured. But as you go through the transformations that you are now going through in your society, and you open up to the idea that your senses can expand and begin to interact once again with the heretofore invisible that's always around you, of other realities and other levels of consciousness within the earth itself, you will begin to honor again, you will begin to own again, you will begin to experience again those interactions. But I will tell you, when you come upon Kerinos, you will find that it will be a very powerful energy. For again, it is the energy itself of winter, the energy itself of the solstice, And that crossing threshold will become more and more meaningful to many of you as you advance in your development toward the idea of the sixth hybrid race. For in our time, upline 700 years from you, in what you call your future, Kerinos is a being that we interact with all the time. It is a presence that we can actually experience in a very physical way, as with many of the other elementals. What you may call the pukas and the sylphs and the gnomes and the silkies and many other beings that exist in different rarefied realms and express themselves as shapeshifters, taking on different forms to represent the kind of energies that they interact with in your reality. They are symbolic beings that can physicalize themselves, archetypal energies and archetypal consciousnesses that can actually physicalize themselves and take on very unusual forms that you would think to be physically impossible. But the only reason they are possible is because they are not physical in the way that you are, though they can express themselves in a very physical and solid way, sufficient enough to interact with them in the physical plane. So these elementals, being that nature, will also be beneficial for reminding you of your own nature and that you are truly walking in a dream, that physical reality is a dream and another expression of a greater archetype of the Gaia collective consciousness energy, of which you are also an expression, even though you express it in a more physicalized way. So as you reclaim your own natural selves, you will also reclaim and express a part of your being and a part of your consciousness that is also vibrationally connected to the elementals. For you contain that as well. For you contain everything that exists in nature. And everything is a symbol and a reflection and a shard of that shattered mirror that has broken into an infinite number of parts and reflect back to you in an infinite number of ways all the different aspects that you are, that you can vibrate in harmony with, that you can adapt and adopt into yourselves to express yourselves as the greater being as you walk through the dream of physical life. Is what we're saying making some sense to you? All right.